Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. I am Horace Mitchell, and it has been my privilege and honor to serve our community as president here at CSU Bakersfield over the last 10 years. I'm pleased to extend to each of you a personal welcome, as well as to welcome you on behalf of our distinguished faculty, our dedicated staff, and our more than 8,500 great students, including especially the faculty and staff of the Kegley Institute of Ethics. Excuse me. A significant part of the university's vision is to strengthen our community engagement. The Kegley Institute of Ethics epitomizes that goal by bringing to the campus excellent scholars and other outstanding speakers to address our community on significant issues of our time. Tonight, the Institute presents its 28th annual Charles W. Kegley Memorial Lecture entitled Sowing the Seeds of Justice, the Central Valley 75 Years After the Grapes of Wrath, with our distinguished guest speaker, the Honorable Cruz Reynoso, former California Supreme Court Justice. Welcome, Justice Reynoso. We are honored to have you with us. He will be formally introduced shortly. We extend our thanks to all of our sponsors and supporters for their generous gifts and support of the Kegley Institute of Ethics and tonight's program. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the director of the Kegley Institute of Ethics, Dr. Christopher Myers.
Gotcha. Thanks. Was that Phil with the quick line about the water under the, was that you? Welcome, folks. It's terrific to be able to host our event tonight. I have to, on behalf of our wonderful technical crew, evidently there's a slight chance that all of the lights will go off in the middle of this. Their console board is acting up. We're told if that happens, it's only about a minute's worth. Don't panic. Don't go rushing to the... I would probably will let Justice Reynoso pause, or I'll let you feel it as you wish. But I'm told it's a very slight chance. But nonetheless, we felt best to warn you. So it's a great testament to the reputation and the power and presence of Justice Reynoso that we have so many supporters, so many folks who work to bring him to our community this evening. Each saw the terrific value in his presence and in his ability to talk to us about the relationship between what the Jode family saw in person and so much of what's happening in the Valley today. So I'd like to thank all of those supporters individually. First, Robert Tafoya and Sandra Serrano were instrumental in pulling together this team. Robert and Sandra, could you... There they are. Thank you. They were also individually generous in addition to helping us pull together a support team. Special thanks to Emilio Huerta, to Pat Jennison and the Kern County Bar Association Charitable Foundation, and to Phil Rudnick, the jokester a minute ago. Thanks also to David Torres, Jose Guerrero, the Kern County Bar Association Defense Attorney Group, and Glenn Pierce from Gotta Go Bail Bonds. Are all those folks here tonight? And most importantly, as always, our deepest gratitude goes to San Joaquin Community Hospital. Are there any representatives tonight? And to Neil Marshall, Vice President for Kern Schools Federal Credit Union. Neil, can you stand? There he is. Both organizations have been our longtime sustaining supporters, without whom we could not do these programs. And one added little thanks to Victor Martin from our development office, who helped also pull all this together and put up with an occasional tirade from a certain director of a certain institute. Thank you, Victor. Really appreciate it. So why are all these folks so excited to bring Justice Reynoso? It's really interesting. I've done now probably almost 40 of these introductions. And this is by far the hardest I've ever had to do. I've rewritten this thing too many times. The problem is, to do his biography justice, I'd have to be up here all night. And each of the incredible independent activities he's undertaken in his amazing career warrants its own 10 stories. This mic's going in and out too, Ray. Obviously, you don't want me up here all night, so I will just give a few of those highlights. As a child, he worked alongside his parents and his siblings in the California farm fields, wanting to show respect for them, but also move beyond that. He went to community college, and then to Pomona, and eventually to University of California, Cal Law School, Bolt, one of the very best in the world. From there, again, just a touch of the highlights of his extraordinary career. He was a director of the California Legal Assistance Organization. He was a judge on the California Court of Appeal. As President Mitchell noted, he was a justice on the California Supreme Court. He was the vice chairman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which, by the way, was the only group that did a thorough investigation of the voting irregularities in Florida in the 2000 presidential election. And he just dropped a little bomb in a class today that the person who became president was not the one who actually won the election. And then he just moved on to other stuff. Maybe he'll fill in a little bit more of that tonight. He has been a law professor at 3 prestigious universities, currently UC Davis, where he's emeritus. All of this while also retaining a private law practice where he continues the fight against oppression and discrimination. One of the ways to capture just how amazing this career has been, in 2000, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. 2014 years ago, his career was only in its adolescence, given the stuff he has accomplished since then. All of that describes what he's done, which only partially just captures who he is. And one of the amazing things in being able to spend considerable time with him today, he's as tenacious as a bulldog when he sees an injustice or an oppression, and yet he's the kindest, gentlest, most gracious. I want to be a fly in the room when he's taking on some of the world's most powerful, aggressive figures, and watch him work his magic in ways I'm sure he will do with you tonight. So please join me in welcoming Justice Cruz Reynoso.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for that really moving introduction. Muy agradecido, muy agradecido, muy agradecido. It seems to me that we need to ask the question, why are we celebrating 75 years later a book that was written and has been around for that long? And as one writer said, I think we're doing it because it's, quote, it still, quote, packs a punch. And And I think what it means is that so many of the things that were discussed in that book still apply today. Some do not, obviously, but so much of it does. And I think that Bakersfield is an appropriate place to remember, to have that recollection of that book. After all, the book was banned in Kern County, and further, we have the areas here where folks spend a lot of time in that book, in the Grapes of Wrath, and when it was banned here, it was banned, they said, because it was obscene, because it was demeaning of migrants, because it spoke of Hoovervilles, and because one person said the communist wrote the book. He just added the details. So you can see that it was not uncontroversial at that time. But I think it was controversial because it spoke too much of the truth that many folk did not want to hear at that time. As I indicated, many of the matters that it spoke to still apply today. Now, I should tell you that I was born 9 years, is it 9 or 8 years? 8 years before it was written. So I've been around here all the time since that book was written. And so I'm going to, in part, share with you my own personal observations of those days, because I was a farm worker as a youngster. I worked in the Central Valley. I later found jobs as a young person and so on. But you know what? Before I talk about that, I want to talk about something different, just for a minute, because much has happened during my lifetime. And I want to explain to you that I was deported to Mexico when I was a baby. I don't even remember it. I do remember, and I'll mention in a minute, when we came back to this country. But between 1928 and 1939, thousands of Mexicans and Mexican Americans were deported or forced out or encouraged out of California and this country. It was during the time of the Depression, and it was felt then, as it was with the Okies who came to California, that they were, quote, taking our jobs. And so we had that reality. The effort was particularly focused on California, as well as Texas, Colorado, Illinois, Michigan, wherever there were a lot of Mexican and Mexican Americans. The estimates vary greatly. I've read several reports. One report said that 2 million Mexican and Mexican Americans were deported. Of those, an estimated 1.2 million were Americans, as I and my two older brothers were when my parents went back to Mexico. Another estimate is that there were only 1 million, and that about 60% were American citizens. And a final report that I researched says that there were 500,000. So you see, there was a great difference in the numbers, in part, I think, because the numbers were not kept. But at that time, many were deported illegally. Others were simply forced back to Mexico by threats. Other times there were programs. Los Angeles County had a program of paying the transportation for anybody who was willing to go back to Mexico. And I read some articles where they estimated how much money Los Angeles County had saved during that time. I read about the city where I went to high school, Fullerton, and the article indicated how the barrio there had been devastated during that time. I got a call from the California State Legislature. They had learned apparently that my parents went back to Mexico during that time, and they were having hearings on it. And they asked me, would you come and testify? And I told them, well, I'd be very happy to come and testify if I could say anything at all. But the reality is, my parents never talked about it. It's a little bit like what you read about the Japanese internment and how folks simply didn't talk about it. So I said, you know, I'd be happy to come, but I really am not going to be able to say anything. But the legislature later did issue a formal apology for the state of California for those activities. But I ask you, how many of you have heard about that formal apology? Indeed, how many of us have heard about that part of California's history? I think not much. Far more has been written about the internment, for example, of the Japanese Americans, as it should be. But it's interesting to me that so little has been said about that, and I share that with you just because if Steinbeck had concentrated on it, he could have written a wonderful book too, I think, not just about the Okies, but about the Mexicans. My first recollection after coming back from Mexico was running up and down an irrigation ditch that had no water in it. Later I learned that it was Brawley, California. Apparently my parents came back up to this country through the Imperial Valley. They didn't stay there, but that's really my first recollection of this country. Now, when we got back, we ended up in Orange County, California. And I grew up for the first several years of my life in Brea, California. Population about 3,000 in those days. As you can see, I've been around a little while. Now population 50 or 60 or 80,000. I don't know what it is in Brea. But as soon as we got back, I quickly became aware of the suffering that folk were going through during the Depression. We were living in a small house in Brea, California, and folk that we called hobos in those days, now I guess we would call them homeless, would come and knock on the door and ask to be fed. And my mother would always put out this great meal for them, tortillas, carnitas, frijoles, the whole kit and caboodle. We would complain to her that she fed the hobos better than she fed us. And she didn't deny it. And she said that we were lucky at that time to have a father who was working full-time. He was working as an agricultural worker, but he had a full-time job. In Spanish, they're called trabajador de planta. And he was working for the Bastanchuri Ranch in Orange County. There are still streets and other items named after the Bastanchuris. And she says, we're lucky to have a father that's working, so we have a roof over our head, clothing on our backs, and food on the table. And it's our duty to share with others. My folks came from a part of Mexico that's said to be more Catholic than the Pope. And so we were raised as very strict Catholics as youngsters. And I still remember our catechism classes. When she would be putting the clothing out in the clotheslines, she would upend a box or something of that sort, sit us on it, and ask us catechism questions. You know, youngsters learn by having questions asked and then you answer. Well, whenever we didn't answer quite correctly, instead of pinning the next pin on a piece of clothing, she would take the pin and put it on our ear. Well, believe it or not, it was a very effective way of teaching. We didn't forget the answer to that question that was asked. My dad, though he worked as a farm worker, I should tell you that he was proud to be a farm worker. So many people seem to assume that being a farm worker is something that anybody can do. In fact, for most farm work, it requires some skill besides physical stamina and so on. So he would tell us that he didn't care what we did when we grew up. He said, so long as we didn't grow up to be thieves. By which he meant, so long as you do something honorable. In Spanish, he would say, no me importa lo que sean, con que no sean ladrones. And he simply meant, so long as you do something honorable, so long as you do something that's helping the community. So then, by the time that I was going into the second grade, we moved to La Habra, to a small, then small town again called La Habra. Then we moved to a little barrio in the outskirts, maybe a mile away from La Habra, called Alta Vista. And I often say, and I told the students earlier today, that the poorer the barrio, the fancier the name. So it's a very poor barrio, maybe 50 or 60 houses. And I mentioned to the students that at that time, and one student said that she was from there, that the only barrio I knew that was poorer was a barrio called Maravilla, marvelous, near Los Angeles. And a student raised her hand and says, I'm from Maravilla. So she knew, and she agreed with me that it was a poor barrio. So we went there, and again, the Depression was not far from us. And I tell you some of these details of my own experience because I see those reflected in the Steinbeck's work on the Grapes of Wrath. We lived, there was a dump near the barrio. And from time to time, though frequently, whole trucks of oranges would come and be dumped in the dump. Remember, this was during the Depression when many folk were starving and who didn't have enough to eat. And I thought it was so ironic at that time, nonetheless, these oranges were being dumped there. Why were they being dumped there? I didn't know at that time, but I assume from what I've read is that this was an effort to keep up the price of the sale of oranges so the growers could do better, and presumably the farm workers who were working for them. But it reminded me of a portion of the Grapes of Wrath where there's a lot said, not nice things about growers and folk in industry. That's why so many accuse Steinbeck of being a communist or a fellow traveler. Sad to say, much of what he says I think still applies. But he also he also has areas there of the humanity of folk. And there's one passage I remember where an employer, an agricultural employer, had hired 2 or 3 workers and was paying them what they all considered was a living wage. They went to work one day, and the grower says, I'm sorry, I have to cut your wages considerably. And he says, I feel badly about it, but I belong to an organization that sets the rates that we pay, and they just lowered the rates, and I have to abide by that rule. And I was thinking, probably the growers who had put those oranges on those trucks probably had many of those same feelings. They hated to see them just be dumped in a dump, but probably they belonged to an organization that said, look, this is what we've got to do to keep the prices up so we can make a living. So I see those relationships. When we moved to Alta Vista, near La Habra, then we looked for a school to go to. My 2 older brothers and I were old enough to go to school, and we found a school that looked like the schools we had in Brea. But when we went there, we were told that no, we were supposed to go to another school. We went to the other school, and I noticed that everybody in that other school was Latino or Chicano. And I said, why are we being sent to this school? And I was told, well, you're being sent to this school to learn English. Well, in Brea, we spoke nothing but Spanish at home, but nothing but English outside of home. Very often, the neighbors were really very good. They gave us like Sunday comics that we would read and so on. And I knew that I knew English perhaps too well, because in the first grade, a little girl was stumbling over a word, and the teacher was by her trying to help her pronounce the word well. I thought I was helping when I read the word for her. Well, the teacher got mad at me, as logically she should have. I was really interfering with her job as a teacher, and she sent me to see the principal. So I knew that I knew English pretty well. Nonetheless, I was scared to go see the principal, so I didn't. Instead, I went outside, waited until the end of the day when a buddy of mine came out, and we ran home as fast as we could. The next day, I went back to class, and the teacher didn't say anything. She just assumed I had gone to see the principal. But it did strike me straight, therefore, that we were told we were going to Wilson School to learn English when we knew English already. Then I noticed that in fact, there were Anglo-American families that had homes abutting upon the school, but those children were being sent elsewhere. And I soon figured out that it was really a segregated school. And so my brothers and I went to that segregated school, which went up to the 6th grade. So I started seeing many things that didn't seem quite right for me. My first job was in agriculture. I became an orange picker, as I should have been, right, in Orange County. But what we were doing was probably illegal. And this is what was happening. I couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 or 10 when I went to pick oranges. But I went with my older brother. I was too small to be able to carry the ladder. My older brother was big enough to do so. So he carried the ladder and he picked the top part of the orange trees. I couldn't do that, so I would only pick the bottom part. Maybe because of that, in Spanish, they called us ratas, or rats. So we were a rat for our older brother. I say it was probably illegal because the checks would come in our brother's name because we didn't have Social Security numbers. Of course, as you might guess, when I grew up, then I was the big boy, and my younger brother Joe would come as my rata. So I got used to folks doing things that may or may not have been legal, but those were the practices. Incidentally, in California, a statute permitted at that time segregation in school of Chinese, blacks, and mulattoes. I never heard of segregation of blacks or mulattoes because there weren't enough of them at that time in California. I did talk to one Chinese lady who said she went to a Chinese segregated school in the Sacramento area where there were more Chinese. But it's interesting that incidentally, there was no law permitting segregation against Mexican or Mexican Americans, but because there were large groups, that's where the segregation got implemented in those days in California. Fortunately, the federal courts in a case that was filed in Orange County ruled that type of segregation unconstitutional. Interestingly, they ruled that segregation, just by segregation, that is qua-segregation itself, was unconstitutional, not because the schools were inferior or anything of that sort. Incidentally, I thought we got a pretty good education in that segregated school, but there was an element to it that I thought was not good, and that is that the children did not get the enthusiasm to go on with their schooling, so that in the segregated school, most of the boys quit school at age 16, which was then permitted. I think that's what the community expected. Their families normally were needed, so the families expected that. And so I was the only boy that attended that segregated school who actually graduated, only boy from my class who graduated from high school. There were 2 girls, but no other boys. So I thought the segregation itself was not good. The separation of youngsters in that atmosphere was not good. I should tell you that I had early on what I called my justice bone. And when something happened that I thought was completely unjust, I had to do something about it or my justice bone would continue hurting. And I had several of those incidents in my lifetime, but I'll just tell you about the first one. Living in the barrio, we were about, as I say, about a mile from town. And all of the adults would complain that they had to walk to town to get their mail. And so the son of, actually, I think it was Mr. Pastanchure, was married and built a house in an orange grove very near the barrio. And so then I would notice that the rural delivery person would drive out from town all the way to his house, deliver his mail, then drive all the way back to town, would not go an extra city block or 2, it was in the country, but I'm just talking by length, to the barrio to deliver mail. So I went in to see the postmaster, and I told her that the folk in the barrio really would like rural delivery. And she said to me, well, that's not my job. That's not what I do. And I said, well, who does it? Incidentally, I was still in grammar school. I must have been in the 5th or 6th grade. I look at my grandchildren now, and I can hardly believe it. They seem so little and frankly not interested in those things, but somehow I was, because I had this justice bone that was hurting. And so she says, that's not my job. And I said, whose job is it? She said, the Postmaster General. And I said, where's the Postmaster General? She said, Washington, D.C. I said, well, could you give me his address? And she gave me his address. And I said, well, thank you very much. I went back to the barrio, and I must have done it in pencil and lined paper. I wrote out a little petition and had all the adults in the barrio sign it. I'd go door to door. My dad would say to me, ay, Cruz, ¿qué metiche eres? I said, gee, Cruz, you're always getting into other people's business, because he viewed that as sort of government business. And I could tell, frankly, from the smiles of most of the adults, that they didn't really think anything was going to happen. But by golly, I went and got all those signatures, and I sent it to the Postmaster General in Washington, D.C. with a forwarding letter. And by golly, in a couple of weeks, I get this letter, and it was typed, and it was addressed to Mr. Cruz Reynoso. Nobody ever called me Mr. I thought, gee, this is pretty good. But then I was sad to read the letter. It said, thank you for the letter. We want to advise you, however, that we failed to find your petition in it. I felt so badly for years and years. But later, many years later, I worked for the federal government, and I figured it out. They lost my petition. I didn't have staples and all that. When they opened the letter, somehow it went some other place. Nonetheless, in a couple of months, we got notices to get prepared for rural delivery. So I went in to thank the postmaster for what I was sure was all her help in our getting rural delivery, and I've seldom been received so icily. She was not happy with me. I think in Washington, I think it was her job, and in Washington they took it as sort of a complaint that she wasn't doing her job, I think. I don't know, but anyway, I got out of there as quickly as possible. So my justice bone hurt, I confess, several times in the future, including having to do with a segregated school, but I won't go into that because, again, it will take too long to do that. During the Second World War, now this is now not during the time of the Depression, but many of the experiences that I had as a farm worker still reminded me of the work that folk were doing in Grapes of Wrath. I remember going as far north as Tracy, California, where we worked on thinning tomato fields, and working in Stockton in the excuse me, in the onions, topping onions. It's the first time I ever got sick, actually. I rather enjoyed farm work, but on that occasion, when you work in an onion field, there's no shade at all. And so apparently my dad noticed that I was not feeling well, and so he sent me to go sit in the shade by a truck. And when we got home that night, I noticed that I had lines of salt going down my face. I guess I had stopped working so quickly that the sweat dried quickly. I had the salt going down my face. That was the worst farm worker job that I had. Most of the time, and most summers, we would go around the Fresno area, particularly the Sanger area. I remember one time, and again it reminded me of one of the passages near the end of the Grapes of Wrath. We were housed in a barn. We went in and cleaned off a portion of the barn, and we slept and so on in the barn. Most of the time, we actually slept in tents. And mostly we worked picking plums. The whole family went. My dad had decided that we could earn more money because we had a large family. I eventually had 5 brothers and 5 sisters, and we would be paid by the boxes. We paid so much per box. So the whole family would go out and pick plums, and then we would fill, obviously, many blocks. I remember sometimes we had a baby in the family. One of the smaller children would stay at the edge of the orchard taking care of the baby, and the rest of us would be working. Excuse me. But what I remember is one particular occasion where I heard like murmuring by the workers, and I didn't know what was going on, but I was always, as you might tell, rather curious. And then all of a sudden, everybody stopped working. It was a sit-down strike. I mean, I didn't know that that's what it was called, but it was a sit-down strike. And there was a group of 4 or 5 men at the edge of the orchard. So I sort of moved my way over to them. And then the field foreman obviously heard about the sit-down strike, and this was near the Kings River. For those of you who know the Kings River, there's a big embankment normally established over thousands of years, a sandy embankment. And the superintendent or mayordomo, whatever he was, on his pickup truck came barreling down that embankment with the dust flowing behind his pickup truck, and he sees these men, this group of men, and he runs and stops his pickup, and he jumps out, and he asks a question. Guess what the question was? Not what's the problem. He said, okay, who started this? That was his first question. But apparently what happened was that we were being paid less per box than what other growers were paying. And so that word got out, and folk were unhappy, and somehow I couldn't see anybody organizing it, but somehow everybody stopped working. And what I still remember was the power that people can have when they act together. Because it didn't take very long for the foreman to, in talking to those gentlemen, to apparently agree to pay what other growers were paying, and so we and all the others went back to work. Then after picking plums, and incidentally, at that time, I don't know whether it's true anymore, but folk from out of California used to call us prune pickers. Do they still do that? They were ignorant people. You pick plums, not prunes. You know, you pick plums, and then they get dried. And I hate to tell you, but we picked so many prunes so many plums that got made into prunes. They had a big stack, and we kids would run up and down that stack. I hope they cleaned them well before they sold them. You know? So then we would pick grapes, the type of grapes that are made into raisins, and that we stopped after picking grapes because it just went too long. If we tried to pick walnuts, as we did sometimes, it would go even getting closer to the winter time. So on one occasion, I asked the field foreman how long he thought it would be before the grape season would end. And he said, why are you asking? And I said, well, we always get back late to school. We have to work doubly hard. Excuse me, I'm just getting over, I hope, a cold. And that's why the folks put water up here for me. And he says, why are you asking? I said, well, because we get back, we have to work doubly hard to catch up. And he looks at me and he said, well, you're the first Mexican kid I ever talked to who was interested in education. And I remember thinking to myself, 2 things. One, he didn't talk to many Mexican kids about education. And 2, I remember thinking to myself, someday I'm going to go back and look him up, and I'm going to have my college degree in my left hand. I'm going to poke him in the nose with my right hand. Well, as you might guess, later I read about Mahatma Gandhi and nonviolence, so I never did go back to look him up. But when people ask me, when did you decide that you were going to go to college? I really didn't know, because I remember in grammar school we had a Chicano teacher for 1 year, and he took us to basketball games, and he liked us and we liked him. And I remember thinking, gee, maybe I can be a teacher someday. But I don't know whether I even knew that I needed to go to college to be a teacher. But I know when I was in junior high, 7th or 8th grade, I knew that I had decided to go to college, because I still remember that incident where I told myself, I'm going to go back and I'm going to poke him in the nose with my right hand. So I ended up going through high school and community college and college and becoming a lawyer. But I've always been attracted to agricultural areas. And so I accepted a job in the Imperial Valley. And the Imperial Valley, had, I would say, some of the same issues that are described in terms of the relationship of growers to farm workers that we run into over and over again in the Grapes of Wrath. And that is, at that time we had the Bracero program, you recall, for many years. And most of the farm workers at that time were braceros. In fact, many don't know that Cesar Chavez started organizing farm workers while he was still working for an organization that I belonged to called the Community Service Organization. And he started working out of Ventura County, organizing local farm workers who would go up to growers and say, here we are, we're ready to work. And the growers would say, sorry, we've got braceros, we don't need you. And actually, under the law, the local farm workers were supposed to have precedence over the braceros. But the notion was, as the city manager in El Centro told me on one occasion, he and I were talking, and he says, well, Americans just won't work out in the farms, he said. And so that's why we need the braceros. Just as we were talking, however, and he said, Mexican, we need braceros or Mexicans, he said. Just as we were talking, I was looking behind him, and there was a gentleman on a roof tarring the roof. It was so hot that you could see the heat waves going up. And I said, why won't they work? Why don't Americans work out there? He says, it's just too hot out in the fields. It's the Mexicans and the braceros who can take that heat. And I said, well, that's odd. Look at that gentleman up there. He was an Anglo-American, and he was working on the top of a roof with tar. It's so hot, I'm sure a lot hotter than out in the fields. And I said, well, how come he's an Anglo and he's working and it's very hot up there? He didn't answer. But you might guess what the answer was. The answer was that he was getting paid good wages, probably had a steady job, probably was earning enough to support a family. And indeed, those were the issues in Imperial County, as they have been so often in the Central Valley. And so I must say that when I think about issues in the Central Valley, and I'll come to that in a minute, I can't help but think about that. Arturo Rodriguez, head of UFW, and I just wrote a short article that will be published shortly, and we focused on a grower who hires about 5,000 farm workers. There was a vote to unionize in 1990. This is 2014, the last time I looked. He had been found guilty, and I'm talking about after hearings, of firing an entire crew for supporting the union, closing down 6 labor camps in retaliation because the workers had voted for the union, failed to negotiate. The union had all their demands. He never made a counter offer, and to this day, there's still no contract. And indeed, another order has been issued, but he indicates that he's going to take it to the courts. So it seems to me that we have to think about how we have handled agriculture and the farm workers in the Central Valley. I think that it's a shame. I've been reading articles. I mentioned to somebody that I agreed to come and deliver this talk some months ago, and I've been clipping papers, articles that seem appropriate at that time. How many articles, I can't tell you, that I've read from growers saying we're mad even at our fellow Republicans because we need the immigration bill to pass so we can have the Mexican farm workers here in our country. Well, you know, we ought to have a system, it seems to me, where we don't need immigrants or farm workers. Right now, I'm told that practically all the farm workers are Mexican. Half of them are here without documents. It seems to me that the Valley really has to worry about running an industry like agriculture in a way that people could make a living. I don't think it's enough to say, well, seasonal work is simply seasonal. I remember the cannery workers used to be unionized, and presumably their work was seasonal, and yet they got paid well, they had unemployment insurance, and so on. So I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of thinking how we run the agricultural industries in the Central Valley and many of the rural areas of California. I was reading an article that was a political article that said something like this: the essence of a democracy is respect for one another as human beings. It seems to me that we have always run, frankly, the agricultural enterprises. It seems to me odd that, you know, I came by train from Sacramento to Bakersfield, and I must say I had some of the same sense that the Joad family in the Grapes of Wrath had when they first hit California and they saw all the orange trees and they saw the greenery and so on. We still have a really rich, really wonderful state, but that somehow we run our agricultural enterprise in such a way that we require long times of unemployment. Imperial County, the last time I looked, unemployment rate 24%. You know, we need to come up with a different way of doing things. And incidentally, the Bracero program, though I always opposed it, I had a good relation with the Mexican consul in Calexico when I was in Imperial County. And they said, would you mind if we asked Mexico City if you can be our official lawyer? And I said, no, that sounds fine, because then I would get a lot of more referrals from them. I usually get workers' comp referrals from them. Several months later said, gee, Cruz, we're sorry, but Mexico City won't approve it. And the only reason I could think is that I was a vocal critical of the Bracero program. I represented many Braceros in their workers' comp cases, and it was not a good system. A worker would get injured, they could no longer work. The insurance company would insist that they stay in this country while they were being treated. So they were not working, they weren't sending any money home, they were isolated. And anyway, it was, from my point of view, a rather inhumane system. But that's what we've done in these rich valleys that we have in California. And I think we have a lot of work to do in that regard. But incidentally, too, and for a university like this, I think really is an essential part of the following. We need to diversify the economy of these agricultural areas, like the Central Valley, like Kern County, and so on. And I've talked to several folk who spent a lot of time, officials and economists, of why that has not happened in the Central Valley. And their reasons, they talk about absentee ownership of many of the lands in the Central Valley. They say that, well, maybe we haven't had the resources here to have other industries. But you know, I think to myself, look at Switzerland. You know that one of the main enterprises in Switzerland, in Europe, is producing chocolate candies. Where does this chocolate come from? South America. How come they've been so successful? It's brain power. They've learned how to put chocolate together in such a way that people like it. They distribute it throughout the world, and they do well. So universities like this university is a key factor, I think, in helping this community and all of the Central Valley diversify what it does. You know, I grew up in Orange County, as I indicated. Orange County, when I was a kid, was nothing but a rural agricultural county. Now I go to Orange County, and it's an urbanized, wealthy area. In 1952, for the first time, I drove through and by San Jose. At that time, it was nothing but a rural area, beautiful groves all over the place. Now it's an economic center for the world, not just for California or the United States. So I don't accept the notion that just because it's an agricultural area, it can't have diversity and have folk be able to have the jobs that pay good money, have opportunities for young people to not leave this area to go work elsewhere. I talked to a young lady from Salinas. She had left Salinas, an agricultural area, for San Francisco. I said, why did you leave? She said, I didn't have the same opportunities in Salinas that I have in San Francisco. So it seems to me that we have to think a lot about how to bring changes about in these great agricultural areas, how to diversify. So it seems to me one of the serious issues that, as that person says, still packs a punch in terms of what we saw in the Grapes of Wrath and how farm workers were treated at that time, is how farm workers are treated now in a different sort of way, which in turn relates to how we set up our agricultural scheme and what we're doing or not doing. And obviously those things are difficult. I don't have a magic wand, but it seems to me that these areas need to spend a lot of time working with universities like this campus to come up with the industries using brain power. I went to a place south of San Francisco that is a big building that has in it nothing but venture capitalists, people who are trying to start companies, and they're there to experiment on how to do it. I was invited because some folk are trying to start a company, and I learned that they're hoping that I'll be a spokesperson for them if they get going, so they invited me there. But the folk who run it said that they had just rented that building a few months before. They already had 59 companies renting space there, and they go through a 2-week lecture from the owners on startup companies, how you do it and all that, particularly finances. And they said they expect to fill up the whole building, which takes, they say, about 100 such companies. Well, I haven't heard that we have that type of institution in any of the Central Valleys. You know, why should it be only in south of San Francisco and not in Bakersfield, not in Fresno? It just seems to me that that's one of the unfinished business, one of the issues that really, to me, packs a punch in terms of how things were happening 75 years ago and how things have not changed that much in terms of farms, in terms of agriculture, 75 years later. And we need to do a lot of thinking about that. Another thing that comes up in the Grapes of Wrath are the police. The writer was not particularly kind to the police and how they treated people when they were in Hooverville. Incidentally, you might remember, you know, I didn't mention to you that I mentioned to you the deportation of Mexican and Mexican-American families. The president then, Hoover, was one of the proponents of that. Though when he was asked what he was going to do about the Depression, I remember reading that he said, I'm going to pray for the American people. That was his answer to how to respond to the Depression. But when FDR came in, I read that even he, early on, supported the notion of trying to deport as many Mexicans as possible. But coming back to the police, in Grapes of Wrath, he speaks about how the police and the courts and the system was set up to do as much harm as they could to what they call the Okies. And it's interesting that apparently everybody, whether they were from Arkansas or Texas or whatever, they refer to as Okies in that book. Excuse me. And there are problems now with the police too. The police perhaps have the best relationship with the people because they do good and important work. But there are problems. It's impossible under the law to get any information when the police have done something wrong. A farm worker was shot to death in a town in Yolo County where I live, in Woodland, just a few miles from Davis where I live. There were many protests and so on, and nothing happened. So some folk came to me and asked if I would be willing to head up what became a private civil rights commission to check into it. We had hearings. Among the hearings, we had some testimony from a family about the police breaking into their house without a warrant, manhandling the husband and the mother, and the little girl, who was then about 8 or 10 years old, testified before our commission that one of the officers put a revolver to her temple. We asked the sheriff to investigate. He said that he would do so and report in a month. He didn't. We communicated with him again. Then he said, oh, yes, I investigated it, and everything is okay. Everything that happened was legal. And we said, well, what happened? He says, I can't tell you. Under what's called the Policeman's Bill of Rights, those folk can't say anything about what the policeman did, even if they have violated the law. They can't say anything. So sad to say, day in and day out, I read in the newspapers of another killing. There's been another killing in Lodi, California, just south of San Francisco, of a young man. The witnesses there, according to the newspapers, say they did not see a knife in the hands of the person who got shot to death. The farm worker that we tried to investigate about was also shot to death by the police in Woodland. An anti-narcotics unit of 3 officers, 2 of them shot at him and killed him. And they said that they had to shoot him because he drew a knife on them. From our investigation, we have serious doubt that it was even his knife if he drew it, but more importantly, we had 3 witnesses who were there about the time of the shooting who saw nothing in his hand. Nonetheless, the police said, oh yes, everything was fine. The DA even wrote a report where he said, oh yeah, everything was fine. We could not get the State Attorney General, or thus far the U.S. Attorney General, to do an independent study. So no independent study has taken place. Why am I concerned? You may have read about the pepper spray incident at the University of California at Davis. The president of the university asked me to lead that investigation. He didn't call himself, his assistant called. I called the assistant back and I said, you better ask the president again, because I have a reputation for speaking as I see things. And he called back and says, yeah, the president still wants you to do it. I said, okay. So I was the head of the group that did did the formal investigation. We worked with some investigators, very good investigators, who did the investigation. They reported to us, and then we asked questions and so on, and then wrote a report. But what happened after the pepper spray was that the first enunciation by the police was the police chief who said, our officers had to pepper spray them because their lives were in danger. They were surrounded by students and they were being threatened. It proved out to be absolutely not true. The investigators we had were able to put together dozens and dozens, I think maybe hundreds, I forget, so many people have their own photographs. Everybody's a photographer nowadays in America. I used to say that the photographers are the last dictators we have in a democracy, because they say stand up, you stand up. They say smile, you smile. But now I can't say that anymore because everybody is a photographer, and so they were able to contact people who had taken photographs, and they were able to show second by second what was happening. When the pepper spray took place, there were a lot of students. And some of them were saying, let them go, let them go. But there was a lot of room. In fact, one officer had arrested one of the students and took him out to a police car. There was a lot of room. So our conclusion was that one, it wasn't true that they were in danger. If they thought they were in danger, it's because they were ill-trained or didn't see what was going on around them. But what bothered me was that the first statement was they had to do it because their lives were in danger. If the administration had not made that type of investigation, the public would have believed that, right? It sounds perfectly logical. In fact, it was simply not true. And finally, we concluded after investigation that the pepper spraying should never have happened. And we put blame on everybody, incidentally. I thought maybe we'd be in trouble because we put blame on the chancellor because she didn't listen to what she should have listened to, and she was insisting that the movement take place at the time that it did. We put blame on the police because they were all ready with gear expecting a big riot, whereas they had no reason to believe it. The police chief actually asked them not to get in gear, but the lieutenants insisted on it. The whole thing was mishandled, and that's really what we said. But during that time, I met with a lot of experts. One expert came to see me. He's the type of expert that gets hired by police departments to do investigations of police departments and make recommendations. He told me that he had been hired between 50 and 60 police departments. Of those, he said, only one met the standard that he thought all police departments should meet. And the standard that they did not meet was the following. These are formal police officers under the state of California. Thus, they can carry weapons and so on, but they're public servants. And what none of those except one met, the standard he met, was that the police officers would report and arrest a fellow police officer just as they would any other citizen or resident of their jurisdiction. In other words, the notion that we've heard about, which some folk call a bunker mentality, of police officers protecting one another and not speaking when somebody else has done something wrong, he said, was actually true in every single one of those departments except one. Sad to say, I think that was probably involved in the killing of the farm worker that we investigated. But it seems to me that that's a terrible fault in terms of the police, that they will not do their job if one of their own police officers has done something wrong. Every once in a while, you see that a fellow police officer does get arrested. In fact, one just got to prison the other day because he had raped many women on the job. But I think that probably reports came to them from outside the police department, then they had no choice but to investigate. But to me, that's a very serious matter. And so, as I say, I think that just as in the days 75 years ago, we still have a lot of work to do to make sure that our police departments do, in fact, what they're supposed to do. And then, in The Grapes of Wrath, the author is not particularly favorably disposed to the courts or most government agencies. Very favorable, obviously, to the government camp that the Jodes went to and were treated very well, and that was an effort during the Depression. But as a whole, we have problems even there. Many judges are elected publicly, and there's just been an opinion issued by Justice Sotomayor on a death penalty case. Because 3 states, for example, not California, fortunately, permit a judge to override a jury decision on a death penalty. And in several of those states, the jury had decided or split in terms of death penalty or life without parole. And under those circumstances, then life without parole is the judgment of the jury. In many of those cases, the judges overrode the jury and imposed a death penalty. And her study indicates that as they get closer to an election, because these judges are elected, the overriding of death penalty decisions by juries goes up. And then Sandra Day O'Connor, retired Supreme Court Justice, now heads up an organization that's concerned about elections of judges and the judiciary. Sad to say, from my point of view, she joined the other justices in setting aside some American Bar Association standards about what's right and what's wrong when you run for a judicial office. And under the First Amendment, they said anybody running for judge can say anything they want. And so the studies indicate, as you might guess, that judges have been accused of loving murderers, loving rapists, and all kinds of things by the opponent. The response very often, her study indicated, is to have the judge say, not true, I'm tough as nail on criminals. And then they'll talk about how tough they are. And this came up in a separate opinion that she wrote. But meanwhile, as I say, even a relatively conservative judge like Sandra Day O'Connor is leading up now a group, I just got some literature from them, concerned about that. And I must say, I've seen odd things happen. When I was in Imperial County, I hadn't been there more than 6 months when there was a farm workers strike. And a judge who was really a great judge, I really liked him, nonetheless either he was misled by the judges or he hadn't kept up with constitutional law for, say, 50 years. Because the farm workers picketed, as strikers do. He ordered all of the picketers to stop picketing, not to picket quietly, not to picket one every 20 feet or whatever, to stop picketing completely. Well, strikers picket, so they continued picketing. He ordered them all arrested. They were all arrested and put in jail. Most of them were Spanish-speaking, so the lawyers, this is the AFL-CIO Agriculture Workers Organizing Committee, they called it AWOC. They had called the strike, and they had lawyers, but they called me because I think I was the only native Spanish-speaking lawyer in town to see if I would go and talk to the folk in jail about personal medical needs and so on. I considered it a mission of mercy, so I said, sure. I went down, I took notes, I gave it to them. By the time I got back to my office, my partners were very concerned. They were liberal Democrats, but nonetheless they were very concerned that this would appear that we were taking sides in an economic struggle in Imperial County. I remember thinking to myself, you know, it's a lucky thing I have a little card that says attorney at law. If my partners become that unhappy with me, I say my partners, I was an associate, they were the partners, I can set up my own office across the street. Well, I guess they weren't that unhappy with me because they didn't fire me or anything, but I was impressed, one, by how a good judge could somehow do what he did. Clearly unconstitutional. The lawyers then filed and got all the workers out, of course. But I remember thinking that even a good judge could do something like that, and even good lawyers would be concerned that I had done something, not even representing them, simply going in what I considered a mission of mercy. So I just mentioned those as some of the issues that I think relate so well to the issues that we saw 75 years ago in the Grapes of Wrath. Now, I must say that much has changed since 75 years ago, and I would just mention 2 or 3 things to you. The greatest change that I think has really changed the social contract that we have in this country with one another really came during the Depression and during the New Deal, that I think really went a long ways to change that social compact. With Social Security coming into existence, with the emphasis on work, WPA, and even though there were a lot of jokes about WPA, they were hired by the government. We still have in Davis, where I live, they're having a big debate about whether or not a certain small building built during the WPA should be torn down or be kept for historic reasons. They did a lot of good work. I was particularly interested, because I had wanted to be an artist once, about all the artists that got hired during that time that did all those great paintings in post offices and other public works. And I was reading about slavery in America. And much of what we know about slavery was gathered by folk who were hired during the Depression by the New Deal to interview people all over the country. And they interviewed many African Americans in the South, and at that time there were still quite a few older people who had been slaves. And so we learned a lot about the life of slaves because of that. At any rate, there was a notion that the country needed to do something about the Depression, not simply pray to God, but have public policy in favor of it. And then the next big step, it seemed to me, and these were not isolated, as I'll mention a couple of them, was of course the Lyndon Johnson years. Too bad that he got such a terrible name because of the war in Vietnam, because he helped bring about some of the most important changes in terms of the social compact we have with one another. Segregation was rampant in those days. When I came back from Mexico, after studying in Mexico, I went back I had a fellowship to study in Mexico City for 6 months after law school. I came back, my wife and I traveled to the South. Segregation was still clear. The colored bathrooms out in the back, the white bathrooms in the building that were nice, and all that. All the segregation was still going on, despite the fact that the Supreme Court had ruled in 1954, when I was in the Army, that there should not be segregation. An opinion alone means nothing if it's not enforced. So in Lyndon Johnson, we had the Civil Rights Act of '64, we had the Voting Rights Act, and we had, importantly, the War on Poverty. And I must say that to me, of course, because I joined the War on Poverty in terms of being a poverty lawyer, and that still exists, is one of the great changes. But those didn't come in isolation. For example, before the Civil Rights Act, the Congress had, under the leadership of a Republican president, issued the first civil rights legislation ever issued since after the Civil War, in establishing the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, on which I served. And they started getting the data that then, I think, helped buttress what happened later on in the days of Lyndon Johnson. Or I remember President Truman ordering the desegregation of the armed forces. I always thought it was so odd that we had segregation in the armed forces. In fact, when I was in the Army, after law school, I was sent after basic training at Fort Ord, California, to Fort Hollywood in Baltimore. And on one occasion, 3 of us went to downtown Baltimore on a Saturday, I think it was. There were 3 of us. 2 of us were Latino and 1 was black. The Latino was a very light-skinned Latino out of Arizona. And we were walking down the street, and we saw a movie house. And we said, well, why don't we go to the movie house? And the fellow from Arizona says, I'll go buy the tickets. And he came back out and he said, sorry, I couldn't get tickets. The movie house was full. This was Saturday afternoon. I thought, that's odd, but what do I know about Baltimore? Maybe everybody goes to movie houses on Saturday afternoons. And we were walking this wide street, wide sidewalk. And as you know, when you're walking together, sometimes you move away from one another a little bit. When we moved a little bit away from our black buddy, he leaned over and said, sorry, I lied, he said. They said you and I could go in, but not our black buddy. So I told him to go jump. And I remember feeling a sense of fury. We were actually in full uniform at that time. We were about to be sent to Korea. We could have been killed in protecting our country. And yet the U.S. Army wasn't willing to protect our civil rights. By that time, I knew enough. I knew that the Army, if they were unhappy with a business, declared it off limits to any military people. And they often did that, particularly with drinking places near the base, when there had been fights and so on, and they would declare it off limits, and then no Army people could go in. So they could have done the same thing for that movie house. So I just felt really that our country was not protecting us the way it should. Even though Truman ordered the military to integrate, I ran into this fellow, African-American, who told me about, he was raised in Virginia, knew segregation, but was sent to Alabama, I think it was, where there was even more segregation. And one time a sergeant came up to him and says, boy, do we have a good night for you, he says. We're bringing in some black girls from town, so you black boys can have a good dance. And we're going to go have it at this place. And they told him where. And somebody said, how about the white guys? Oh yeah, we're bringing in some white girls for the white soldiers, and they're going to the officers club to have their dance. Well, a little bit of segregation there, it seems to me. This fellow says, wait a minute, the president said there shouldn't be any segregation in the armed forces. And so he says, I want to talk to the commander here. And said, well, we'll call the lieutenant. Came to the lieutenant, he says, I want to talk to the commander about the segregation. He says, the president said we shouldn't have any. He says, okay, I'll take you to the commander. Took to the commander and says, look, there's segregation here. And the commander said, yeah, I know, he said. I said, the President Truman ordered it desegregated. And he says, well, that's fine, he says, but I'm the commander here, and so long as I'm the commander here, things will be done the way I want them done, and that's the way I want them done. And send her to KP, actually not KP, he didn't go into the kitchen, send him to wash windows. So all his black buddies on the way to the dance were laughing at him as he was washing windows. So, you know, you can issue orders, but they still have to be implemented. So we have, as I say, problems with the police, problems, I think, with farm workers, problems with the courts, not obviously as serious as they were 75 years ago, but there's still matters that I think in a democracy we have to worry about. Excuse me. So where are we today? And I guess this is like a summary. I think we really need change in our agricultural economy. We ought not to depend on immigrants, it seems to me. We have to worry in the valley on something I haven't mentioned, but very serious, the subsistence issue, the sinking of our land. I read one article that said that up in Mendota, there's a plaque dated 1977, and there's been a lot of subsistence since that time. But there's a pole that goes up 28 feet, and the sign says, "This is where our crops grew." I think that's all it says. I don't think it gives a date, but if the article gave a date, I don't remember. But it has subsided 28 feet by 1977. I'm sure it subsided more. And yet in California, it's perhaps the only Western state that we have no laws, no control about the water that's under the earth. And yet 30% of agriculture depends on those wells. And as one person said in an article I read, with that sort of subsistence, it means that nature is telling us we can't continue to do this. If we do it, we'll use up all the water. When the land sinks, it can hold less water. And so if we're not careful, in half a century or something of that sort, we won't even have any water in the Central Valley. And yet we're not doing very much about it, certainly not legislatively. So I mentioned that. I'm just telling you some of the issues that I see now. One of the most serious issues, I think, in our state is education. Even in a segregated school, I thought I got a good education. Now, sad to say, K through 12 is not doing the job that it used to do in California. I was chatting with a fellow judge the other day, and we were commenting that when we were younger, if a student was going to a private school, we all thought there was something wrong with them. You know, they just somehow couldn't get along in a public school. Now, if people have money, they're sending their kids to private schools, and the private schools have a lot of money. And I notice when I have sat on the committees that admit to the law schools where I have served, that some of the people most qualified are those who have gone to private schools because they have a lot of money, they have a lot of teachers, they have a lot of opportunities to learn what they need to learn to get high grades in the law school admissions test. So sadly, we're not doing, it seems to me, what we need to do. So from our state point of view, it seems to me that education is really the most serious matter. Also from the state, I do believe that changing the Sworn Officers' Bill of Rights that keeps everything so secret that we can't even know that they've committed a crime and it hasn't been reported. Or there's another killing in Lodi, just south of Sacramento, and they've hired a lawyer to try to get more information. Again, they say he drew a knife of us, even though he was 20 feet away when he was shot. 3 witnesses have already come forward to say we saw no knife. The police have already issued a statement saying they think everything was okay, but nobody can have the report because they say it'll take about a year to do the report before they can say anything to the public. So from my point of view, we really do need to worry about what's called the Officers' Bill of Rights so that we as the public can find out what our public officers are doing. And finally, in terms of our nation, I think that one of the greatest issues we have is income inequality. Or as one article said, greed and Wall Street. You know, I took the time to read a long report on what caused the recession. And their final conclusion was that it was a lot of practices, many of them illegal, some legal, because Wall Street had spent millions and millions of dollars in Washington making political contributions and working with the agencies that deal with the rules that have to do with Wall Street. And their final conclusion really is that a simple word like avarice or like greed really explains what happened in Wall Street. But greed has cost this country a great deal in terms of unemployment and suffering. I'm working with a group now that wants to build, as they had done in the past, housing for working class people. And they point out that black and brown families lost 90% of their equity during this time because 90% of their wealth, because most of their wealth was in housing, and so many of them lost their housing. And so they're anxious to help folk get houses, but also help them economically start building up some economic power. And incidentally, the reports are that 60% of the children in California live in poverty. So, and then I pick up the paper the other day, and the headlines say the rich are partying as they did in 1928, just before the recession. Then it goes on to explain that the top 1% now have as much money as they did in 28, and that the difference between what they're earning and what the common folk are earning, the middle class and poor are earning, has expanded tremendously, far more than it's ever expanded before. So we need more opportunity for everybody in America, but you can't get that without some assets, so that you can help your children get a good education. You can perhaps establish a business if you want to and have an interest and so on. But you can't have that if you don't have some equality of income. And indeed, many, including Henry Ford, you remember, said, I'm going to pay all of my workers, what was it, $5 a day, so they can afford to buy a Model T. And many economists have argued that our economy is better if folk have the money to buy the cars, the things that we all need, because that makes the economy run. That the notion that somehow just simply having money to invest is the best thing for the economy, some economists simply disagree with that. I look at the human element, and I just see a lot of suffering that's happened the last few years, again, because I think of greed. And finally, I must say that presently, we have a great political and social debate going on in our country. And basically, it's between many people, including several who are running for president, who say they are interested in having limited government. And to them, limited government means having the government do as little as possible, particularly the social programs that help the poor, that help the needy, and so on. They wanted to simply be small enough that we worry about protecting ourselves from foreigners, and really that's about it. And the notion that others have that in a democracy, the government should do what a majority of people wanted to do and are willing to pay. And I think that's a really serious discussion that we have in this country. I happen to believe, as you might guess, that in a democracy, that it ought to go by what people want to do and are willing to pay. You know, our economic system that we have is not really part of our democracy. You know, so often people are accused of being socialists and communists because they think that happens to be against our democracy. Actually, it's not. That's an economic system. We have a political system that says that government ought to do what the people wanted to do. And indeed, when I was through grammar school, I always believed that, and I think that's probably what gave rise to my justice bone, because I really believed what the teachers told me. But I think that's a real debate that's going on now. But you know, I still continue to have faith, as you might guess. I'm 82 years old. I'm still fighting for the things that I believe we need in this country. And I was reading an article by David Matsumoto, the Chinese-American guy who writes about agriculture in the Valley. And he said that he has a lot of faith in the people of the Valley. They, in fact, will be able to meet the challenges of the future. And I'm pleased that somebody that knowledgeable has that sort of faith, because we need that faith to keep going. And I liked a comment that's attributed to Cesar Chavez. You know, there's so many comments that now are attributed to Cesar Chavez. I'm never quite sure whether somebody just attributed it to him, but it's a good comment. He says, "We do not need a perfect government. We need perfect participation." In a democracy, I think that's really true. But in all of that, I think institutions of higher education like the campus here are really keys. And it seems to me that with faith and with institutions of higher education like this, we can indeed do what Abraham Lincoln said we could do. He would speak of the standard maxim. He said our Constitution has a standard maxim, and he spoke of that at the time the Constitution permitted slavery. Despite that, he said, yes, it recognizes the reality of slavery, but it has within it a standard maxim of democracy, of respect for one another. And it seems to me that we need to look forward to living under that umbrella of the standard maxim that the Constitution has, that respects one another, and that looks forward to having us all have indeed a profitable future. Thank you very much. I was told that you would have all kinds of questions after my talk, so I would be very happy to entertain any questions that you might have, and I'll probably have to repeat the question because I don't see that you have mics. Anybody, or did I talk too long? Here are a couple of questions. Yes, sir. The question is, how do I feel about having open borders and doing away with immigration entirely? Well, there's always been a dichotomy, as you know. In current years, we have expanded the borders economically, not only with Mexico. Incidentally, the three most important countries for trade with the United States are Canada, China, and Mexico. And so we have opened up that mercantile reality. We have meanwhile built fences around Mexico. There's a great irony in that. There have been only 2 incidents of people coming to this country with bomb materials in their cars. Both of them came from Canada. I haven't seen any fences in the Canadian border. Somehow they're all in the Mexican border. So I don't believe for 1 minute that the border has gone up because we are worried about physical protection for our country. I hate to say, but I think there's a lot of prejudice involved in it. It used to be, when I started practicing law, that the only thing you needed to immigrate to this country was, one, to be eligible to immigrate. That is, that you didn't have certain diseases, etc., that you didn't have a criminal record, and so on. And what you needed was an employment an employment offer. So I helped many immigrate to this country, mostly farm workers who had been here as braceros. The growers knew them. They wanted them back as immigrants, and I would help them immigrate. So it used to be very easy. Then we passed new laws that have made it so difficult that you may have read about the undocumented immigrant who became a lawyer, and he had actually been approved as an immigrant something like 15 years ago, but was still in a line to finally get approved because there's so many people in the line. So it's become practically impossible. Nonetheless, I must say that that I'm not sure. I'm not sure what would happen if we open our borders completely. I think we need to change things completely. I think we need to be realistic in terms of who wants to come here and who we need here. But I don't have an opinion on opening the borders completely to the whole world. Frankly, I'm a little bit afraid of it because I don't know what would happen. But I do know that we've had practices, immigration practices in the past that have worked that we're not doing now. You know, I went down to Imperial Valley, and it's the first time I had been down there since the fence went up. And I had such a sense of sadness seeing that huge fence dividing Imperial Valley from Mexicali. When I was down there, another lawyer and I actually went down to Mexicali to take some classes on how to write good business letters in Spanish. You know, the interchange was constant. I'm sure there's still a lot of interchange now, but it's a lot tougher. So I'm sorry, I really don't have a formal opinion on that. I've given a lot of thought of changes that I would like to see. A colleague of mine actually wrote a book where he recommended opening the borders completely, and many did not receive his suggestion very well. But I think it's something we ought to consider. So I hope I answered your question as much as I could. I saw another hand. There was a hand over here first, but since I see one over here, I'm just coming so I can repeat the question.
I had a question. You talked a lot about police brutality and murders that happen. With the recent leaks that we have from WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, what do you think that we can do, like if it's government agencies that we can reach out to, or even community projects, or just people together online, what do you think we can do to ensure that the NSA, police forces, all stay as clairvoyant as we obviously are today?
I'll paraphrase the question, but basically it's what can we do about so much secrecy in the government? That is, it's not just what I mentioned about not being able to find out what the police have done, but he mentioned Snowden and that revelation. I just heard an interview with a longtime writer who said, who's investigated many scandals in government. And he said, you know, I always used to be rather suspicious of the conspiracy theory. But after seeing what Snowden has been able to make public, you know, when people say the government is doing something, I think, you know, maybe they're right, because he has made so many things public that the government had denied or that the public did not know about. And, you know, I hate to say, but I think that Snowden just got some sort of big award. I forget what it was, but I rather agreed with him. Frankly, I consider him a hero, not a criminal. And you know, again, you know, I support Jerry Brown, but I'm mad at him every other day. I support Obama, but I'm mad at him every other day. I mean, they have said that they have implied at least that if he comes back, he's going to be charged with all kinds of crimes that, in fact, even call for the death penalty. I think it's atrocious. I think that the deed is done. It's been of great help to this country, and if nothing else, we ought to come back. We ought to let him come back and live in peace. And I do believe him. And there's just been a long article written in a magazine. I forget which one. I heard an interview on the radio, and he was asked, why do you think he did what he did? And then they quoted something that Snowden had said, where he said, there's a limit to how much wrong one can see until a certain point. And I reached the point where I couldn't do it anymore. And so I decided to make these things public. And then he was asked, why, or then a reporter that he met, remember he met with two reporters early on, said, why are you doing this? You know, you could just give us all this stuff and not give us your name. And he said, no, he said, well, he says, no, I don't want to run. He says, people should know that I did this. Then the reporter said, of course, certainly the government would know right away that he was the guy that did it anyway. And then the reporter said, how much do you think ego accounted for his saying that he wasn't afraid that people would know that he was the one that did it. And he says, well, there might have been a little bit of ego, but I think basically what he said was, he meant what he said, and that is that he wanted to make it public because he thought the American people needed to know. And you know, when you consider that we went to war in Iraq on false information, and how many people got killed? You know, false information given to us by the government can have serious, serious consequences. It was mentioned that I mentioned earlier that in the, with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, we did an investigation of what happened in Florida when a president was named as the winner by the Florida politicians. And my simple conclusion is that a person was sworn in as president who did not win the election. So, you know, things can happen, and I think the more information we need, the more information the people of this country have, the better off we are. So that's the way I feel about that. I hope I stated the question correctly. I see nodding. Okay, I saw some other hands, I thought. I thought there was one over here. Yeah. The question is that many folk who run for public office very often stress their business background. And is that important? How does that relate to their role as public officials? My answer is that I think it's one of many things that actually do count. If you've been a good business person and you know about finance and so on, I think it does help. It doesn't answer everything, because what's most important really are the public policies that they will be voting on. And so you can have a person with a business background that has one political philosophy, another one who also has the business background who has another philosophy. So I think you've got to ask more about how they feel about the public issues of the day. I remember walking out of church one day, and this young friend of mine says to me, Cruz, he says, there's this election coming up, and there are these things that we have to vote on, some changes in the Constitution. He says, I've been listening to the ads really, really carefully, and I can't make up my mind. I said, you've been doing what? Listening to the ads. They're meant to deceive you. You don't listen to the ads. Go and study carefully the packets that we do get in California about the initiatives, who's sponsoring it, what they do, and so on. They'll tell you a lot more than the ads. So in looking at what we should do for politicians or for those initiatives and so on, it's so important that we as citizens be educated, I think. Okay? Let's see, here and then here, and I thought there was perhaps yes, sir.
You discussed the importance of higher education to the future of economic diversity, but with rising tuition costs and the debt that comes with it, what changes do you think should be made to our higher education?
One of the elected officials that I'm mad at right now is Jerry Brown. He's saying that, oh, it's wonderful, we got new taxes, we now have a surplus, everything is wonderful. Everything is not wonderful. When I went to public school, they were truly public. When I went to a community college, I paid zero for my education. Now they pay thousands of dollars. When I went to law school, I paid zero for my education. Now they pay $50,000 a year. If we don't have good public education, we're not going to have the people in this state that have the education to run the economic power of this state. In fact, this state greatly enhanced after the Second World War. Why? Because we had the veterans who came back, who under the GI Bill went to college, got an education, and helped this state balloon economically speaking. Then I have one other concern, and it's this. In the lower grades, 50% of the youngsters are Chicanos. That means that in a few years, 50% of the state will be Chicanos. Yet right now, we have the lower rates of improvement among the Chicano students. If we don't do better by them, we're all going to be in trouble. My former tocayo, former lieutenant governor, whose last name was Cruz, used to say, the issues of California are the issues of the Mexican American. And I think that's true. I think what's happening with education is absolutely atrocious. I'm one of those people who still believe in the plan that had been put together that promised every Californian a free public education from K through 12, through college, and through graduate school. And that's the type of system that I think we absolutely need. So the answer to your question is, it ain't right now. I'm glad that we still have legal services for the poor in the Central Valley, and that California Rural Legal Assistance still exists. I'll just tell you a quick story to show you how important it can be. In Imperial County, when I was down there, we had a large irrigation district called the Imperial Irrigation District. They hired few folk of color, even though there were many folk of color in Imperial Valley, particularly Latinos, but blacks and Indians and Asian Americans. Very few of them were hired. CRLA then filed a lawsuit against the IID, and it went to court, in federal court in San Diego. And something funny, sort of crazy happened. The judge called the lawyers in and to discuss the case. And the lawyer defending the IID said, as explanation why some things might not be right, he said, well, you know, he says, during the Depression, many people came to California from Texas, and many of them only got as far as Imperial County, and some of them still remember the Alamo. You know, he was defending the IID. I thought that was a very bad statement to make for the IID, because he was basically admitting there was discrimination. So the trial went on for a little while. The judge calls them back and says, you know, I may be conservative, he says, but I'm not blind. I think you folks better get together. And indeed, the plaintiffs and defendants got together. They had an affirmative action plan. That's one of the best I've ever seen, where the IID agreed to immediately start hiring for the lower skilled jobs, irrespective of race and ethnicity. Had more time to hire people who were engineers and all that. But in a little while, folk were being hired without discrimination. So legal services can be very important, I think, in bringing a bit of justice to when there's elements of injustice. Unfortunately, Congress has not funded legal services the way they used to be funded. Congress has actually put in a provision that says that legal services cannot be involved in class action suits, which is the type of suit that was filed. Legal services cannot represent the undocumented. So there's a certain antagonism by Congress toward legal services, though it still exists. So I think we have to be careful to do whatever we can to support legal services, because, you know, I do a lot of pro bono work, and I do that for folk that obviously can't hire a lawyer, and you know, poor people have practically as many problems, many more problems than people who are not poor. They just don't have the money to hire lawyers, and the legal, and it's estimated. In California, I think we have one lawyer for every couple of hundred people or something of that sort. Legal services a few years ago, it's probably worse now, has one legal services lawyer for every 10,000 people. So you can see that we need a lot more help in terms of legal services lawyers, but until they get those resources from Congress, it's not going to happen. And that ties in to the broader issue I mentioned a minute ago about what our government is about. Is it a limited government that does practically nothing for the people but provide safety from foreign attacks? Or is it a government that does what the people want it to do and are willing to pay for it? And it seems to me that the people support legal services, and it's a matter of trying to get Congress to agree with the people. Sometimes Congress just doesn't agree with the people. For example, on minimum wage, something like, what is it, 80–90% of the American people think that minimum wage should go up. Many in Congress are still against it, and apparently it's not going to go up because they're opposed to it. So a lot of work needs to be done, I think, with our representatives in Congress. One more question.
Thank you. Well, that kind of touches a little bit on it, but I know can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. I know you mentioned financial inequality and economic inequality, and higher education is pretty much a key component to marginalizing that gap. What other examples can you give to marginalize that gap of, Wall Street to lower class? Other than education, is there a way to marginalize that gap?
The great middle class in America was formed after the Second World War by unions. Since that time, only 7% of the employees who work for private employers are union members. So I think that in many ways the unions, even though many people don't like them, really were an instrument for creating the middle class. So that, for example, a person working in Detroit building cars, mass production cars. So it didn't take any more skill to work in that production than it does to be a farm worker, for example. And yet they got good wages, they were able to have homes, they were able to buy cars, they were able to buy boats, and so on. So that's one possible answer. Unfortunately, I think that some of the public unions are giving the union enterprise a bad name when they insist on certain wage increases or whatever, and those that they negotiate, mainly the public officials, don't feel like saying no, and they give in, and we sometimes end up in trouble, whether it's for retirement, as has been much publicized nowadays, and I don't think that's as serious as people say it is. So the American people now have, mixed feelings about unions, but that's certainly one of the answers. Education, incidentally, I think is really the key answer. But then beyond that, economic opportunity, that is, having folk go to places like the one that I mentioned of startup companies and have the skills to be able to have their ideas about what will make something work, and then have their own businesses and make it work. Small businesses, as I understand, hire most of the workers in our country. It just doesn't take General Motors, for example. So small businesses are very, very important in the economic life of this state and this country. And I think many people with a proper incentive, with a proper education, and importantly, incidentally, with some assets, because the studies indicate that very often when folk had paid off much of their loan in their houses, they could borrow on their houses to start small businesses. Now, since the recession, that has practically disappeared. So having families have assets becomes very important. So we've got to worry about how can this happen. This one group that I'm working with that's trying to build houses for working class families actually argues that as they have more ownership of their houses, if they ever want to start a business, they can borrow money off it to start a restaurant or start a small factory or whatever. But I do know that it can be done. I have two cousins who came to this country many years ago, and they were fascinated by working in a factory. So they went back to Mexico in an area that didn't have any factories, and by golly, they started a factory. And and they did pretty well, but then one of the brothers decided he wanted to start his own factory. He was telling me about it, and what he ended up doing was setting up a factory of furniture, but done by plastic, not by wood. But it looks so real that it looks like wood. And he was selling very well in Mexico. Then a recession came. They weren't doing so well. So he says, we've got to go worldwide. And so he says he came to this country. He hired people to go all over South America. He chose the U.S. for his own enterprise. And he went to Florida. And he would show people his furniture, and then he would say, well, first he'd try to find independent furniture companies, because so many like Sears and all that wouldn't be interested. And then when he found them, he would say, look, are you willing to sell this furniture? I will give you this furniture, and you can do whatever you want with it, but if you sell it and you like it, then we'll be in business. So he sold the business. People liked it. And so then he says much of his business now is sending furniture from Mexico to the U.S. and much of it to Latin America. So he started with practically nothing, but you've got to have a will, you've got to have some knowledge, and they had gotten that knowledge actually here in California, and then you've got to have some assets. And with that combination, people could do it. I keep wondering why it is that it's the cities other than the rural valleys in coastal California that are doing so well. San Diego, Orange County, San Francisco, San Jose, and all that, and yet the inland part, the San Joaquin Valley, the Sacramento Valley, and so on, are not doing well economically at all, with high unemployment and so on. There ought not to be that difference. And I don't have all the answers, but I've just made some suggestions about how in the world this area can compete favorably with the coastal cities and the coastal areas. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, right. Okay, that was it. Thank you very much.